Welcome to the Lazy CEO podcast, where Jim Schleckser, author of Great CEOs Are Lazy and founder of the CEO Project, features compelling experts and topics for CEOs of mid to large size companies. Now, let's get started with the show.
Welcome, everybody, to another Lazy CEO podcast. My name is Jim Schleckser. I am your host today, and we have a guest now, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. Don't worry about that. For those of you that know me, and maybe some of you do, some of you don't, but I have an alter ego, and my alter ego is my involvement in wine. A number of years ago, I decided to get kind of into wine beyond the drinking part, but actually the studying part. And if anybody has ever done this, it's got phenomenal history and agriculture and geology and chemistry, and like just all of this comes together in wine across thousands of years, including, wars and death and lovers. And I mean, just taxation and just crazy what intersects with wine. So when offered the opportunity to talk to somebody who is working on a book, soon to be released book, in the wine space, and particularly for a very, very critical moment in history, I jumped at the opportunity to talk to him. So I have today with me, Mark Gudgel. Hey, Mark, how are you?
Hey, doing great. Thank you for having me.
Welcome. So I'm super excited to talk to you today. I think you and I could just geek out to wine for a long time here, but we'll try to keep it at the right level. So let's just start with kind of, what got you interested in wine in the first place?
Sure. Back when we were dating, my wife and I would drink wine. I remember, in fact, I told this story to a friend. I got back from Napa yesterday, and I told this story to a friend out in Napa. But I remember, we had gone to a Train concert while we were dating, right after we got engaged. And Train came out with a wine they sold at Target called Drops of Jupiter, and it cost $12. And occasionally I would splurge on that, but it cost twice as much as the wine I was used to drinking. So it was a splurge.
That's funny. Well, even now, though, 90% of all wine that's drunk is below $20 a bottle. So, when I get asked about that, they go, well, is it good wine? I'm like, for $10 a bottle, it's not a bad bottle of wine, right? It's all relative, right?
Well, absolutely. Yeah. I tell people, a lot of times people will ask me what's good wine. And I tell them every time, I say, whatever you like, as long as you can afford it. I like Petrus, but I can't afford it. Not good wine for me. But if you like Sutter Home White Zinfandel, enjoy the heck out of it, man. And know that I'm jealous of you because I don't enjoy that bottle and it costs about $4. So I wish I did.
Yeah. Sutter Home White Zin, known as the gateway drug to all wine drinkers. I think we all started on Sutter Home White Zinfandel and kind of, hopefully our tastes evolved over time, right?
So that's so true. That's so true. I reviewed Sutter Home for American Winery Guide years ago. And my editor called me. He goes, "You're giving Sutter Home 4 stars out of 5. I said, yeah. I said, this is one of the most important wineries in the world. How do people get from Busch Light to Cabernet Sauvignon? Not without rungs in the ladder. And that White Zin is it.
No, they drive right through Sutter Home on the way there. Every one of them. Absolutely.
Absolutely right.
So, let's just go to geography for a minute. And let me just make a connection to Napa and California wines first.
Sure.
When I was growing up, I lived in California. And I lived in a town called Saratoga, which is sort of south of the Napa Valley area. But in Saratoga was Paul Masson Wineries, which I think is actually a pretty notable firm in the area. And at that time, they sold these kind of iconic carafes with foil tops on them. So that kind of was what got me into the wine business. But let's go back to the beginning of Napa. Who really and what group of people really got Napa started? Because I got to imagine it was a lot of nothing for a long time.
Well, what it was, I think first and foremost was the home of the Wapo. And they knew way before anybody else how rich this area was with, I mean, you've got this beautiful riparian space that carves its way in between these two fairly small but beautiful mountain ranges. And I mean, everything grows there, and there was an abundance of wildlife and game and fish, and it was a really idyllic space. And then you wind up, fairly quickly, the Spanish are attempting to make their way up the coast, and there's a really quick turnaround where the Spanish are no longer responsible for Mexico.
Right.
The Mexicans become independent. But Mexico is this immense, sprawling empire, and there just aren't that many Mexicans. And so they can't keep a grip on it. So they attempt to build outposts and to send expeditions up the coast and to hold on to their land, but it's very difficult to do. And so one of the
This
things
is when California, as we call it today, was part of Mexico, right? Back in the
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
what the area you're talking about. Okay, good. Keep
Yeah,
just
so-
putting it in context. And by the way, I should have started with Mark is got a book coming out on the history of Napa Valley, particularly in the wine area. So that's why we're focusing on this area. So I forgot to provide some context. So my bad for not doing that. But carry on with the Spanish. And I'll just add, one of the great field trips we used to go on when I lived in California was to go to the Spanish missions, which was their outpost trying to, retain control. So carry on. Go ahead. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, they wind up engaging in a strategy, and there are whole books about this, where they issue massive, what they call ranchos to people, huge swaths of land, usually measured in leagues, usually there's somewhere between 6,000 and 12,000 acres. The largest was about 80,000 acres. That one was issued to General Vallejo late in the process. But they're issuing big chunks of land to people, partly to encourage them to live there and partly to get some development going, and it works. So there's this, I love, the historian Lynn Weber refers to Yount, George Yount, as ugly and industrious, and I love that. People have different opinions on him. Gump just wrote a great book on Chelyshev, on Andrei Chelyshev, one of the most important figures in the valley, but he seems to have a favorable opinion of Yount. Most of us don't. Yount moved there and was the first Americano. He was actually from Missouri. So he stakes out Rancho Camus. And of course, that name is famous in wine, right? And he's how that comes to be. And then Yountville, the town of Yountville.
Everybody's been to Yountville, right? Yeah.
At this point, yeah. But for the longest time, it was a no man's land. So he actually names that town Sebastopol when he builds it, by the way. And I've never been able to decide if he knew there was a Sebastopol 25 miles away in Sonoma or not. But when he dies, they rename it Yountville. So you've got these pioneers, if you like to call them that. And then you've got folks, really establishing the wine trade. Tubbs, who establishes Chateau Montelena. Of course, Charles Krug, the Beringer brothers, Tiburcio Perot, and on and on and on. Jacob Schramm. And they build their wineries, and the Martinis and Niebaum.
Now, just ethnically, was this primarily Italian? Well, some of those names are German, right? So I'd always thought that this was an Italian ethnic group that had come to Napa and grown the grapes of their childhood, right? So you got all these Italian variants coming into Napa in the early days. Or did I get that wrong?
Well, I mean, there are Italians, right? The Martinis are Italian.
Sure, clearly, right? Yeah.
And Cesare Mondavi is Italian, although he post-prohibition. I think it's worth noting that the Mondavis show up on the scene later. The people we're talking about in the earlier stages are pre-prohibition. Jacob Schramm is a German. Charles Krug is a Prussian. Augustin Harathi, who founds Buena Vista over in Sonoma, he's responsible for bringing a lot of grape cuttings in, and as are many others, Tiburcio Perot too. Perot's a Mexican, Harathi's a Hungarian. So
what
really
are the species
an
that they grew,
amalgamation.
and what are the grapes that they grew in those days then?
Sure. Yeah, it was a lot of experimentation. And this is where the Napa Valley early on and forever after gets a huge edge on the industry, because the French have
Sure.
laws about their laws pertaining to what they can grow, right? So we don't call them Bordeaux varietals because the Bordelais favor them. We call them Bordeaux varietals because if the Bordelais planted anything else, it would be against the law.
Yep.
And so, and the same is true. I had a beautiful wine with a winemaker named Pax Mall the other day, and it was co-fermented 50% Syrah, 50% Viognier. And I said, this is what Côte Rôtie wishes they could do, but they can't, because as soon as they exceed 20% of Viognier, they've broken the law, and most of them use more like 5. Right. So, so America was and remains the Wild West of winemaking. If you think Cabernet Franc will grow there, plant it, see what happens. I was writing a piece yesterday about the Truchards down in Carneros and this little block of Cab Sauv they've got in a land totally known for Burgundian varietals, but that Cab is awesome, and they can do it. There's no law that says, well, Carneros is Pinot and Chardonnay, so don't plant anything else.
Right. Interesting. That's kind of a story of America, right? Innovation, rules don't matter. Rules are suggestions. Let's just try it, and it shows in Napa and in the balance of California and even generally in the United States.
Yeah.
So let's talk about prohibition. That was a kind of a tough period. We were in the wine business in Napa, and all of a sudden America doesn't want no alcohol.
Right.
So talk to us about how they survived and the implications of that to the industry during those days.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are two things. One thing that's funny, Americans did want alcohol. I was actually
as the Kennedys will let you know that they definitely wanted alcohol, right? And Al Capone.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And Capone's actually important to this story. So I was actually so hard on prohibitionists that my editor told me to dial it back. Wow. Because it just makes me mad. Like, my wife doesn't drink. I don't care if you drink or not, but don't tell other people what to do.
Right.
You definitely don't try to legislate your own.
Well, be careful. This was a Presbyterian idea, temperance.
Where there are 4 Presbyterians, there's a 5th.
Oh, I like that.
that was my takeaway from my 4 years of divinity school. Okay. So, at any rate,
prohibition.
Yeah, prohibition is murder to the industry, but not to alcohol consumption. So either people shut down or they got a dispensation from the church to make sacramental wine, and many did that, or they grew grapes, turned it into concentrate and shipped it around, because prohibition, it was legal for I believe the male head of the household, if I'm not mistaken, to make up to 200 gallons of wine for his own personal consumption. So the big takeaway isn't that people stop drinking wine. People drink about 3 times as much wine during Prohibition as they did leading up to it.
Wow.
The takeaway is that the quality of that wine plummets. Yeah. Whereas before
it's bathtub brew, right? It's made at home.
God. Before, you had people who knew how to make wine, making the wine, putting it in a bottle, and all you had to do was open it and drink it. Now you're buying grape juice, putting it into a lead clawfoot tub in your garage, covering it with a musty tarp so that the mice don't get in, and fermenting it with whatever yeast you can find, realizing that it's terrible and dumping so much sugar in it that you can choke it down. So you go from masterfully produced wines by people who knew how to make wine, like Martini,
right?
Whatever Uncle Joe could make in his garage in Illinois. And that has a long-standing effect on the industry. Americans Americans still to this day drink pretty sweet wine on average.
Interesting. Now, I thought go back to the sacramental wine angle. I thought a lot of the Napa institutions got that dispensation and made sacramental wine but the others went to this grape juice model. So it was either sacramental grape juice or go out of business. Those were the three options.
Right. And the third option was by far the most prevalent.
Yeah.
Either tear out your vines and plant fruit and nuts, which still grew well there and which were not illegal, or try to make a go of it with grapes. And a lot did that. The Eschel brothers, what today is Trefethen, and Martini, but Martini, I think, also had an dispensation. Of course, Brother Timothy. Well, it wasn't Brother Timothy at the time, but of course the Greystone gets a dispensation, and so there are those, but they are few and far between, and it's a struggle for 13 years.
Interesting. So we're come out of Prohibition. What changed?
Well, nothing very quickly.
Okay.
And it's after Prohibition, it's like, okay, well, that's great, but the equipment's gone. So this is a little tangential, but I love Trappist ales. And for years, Spencer Brewery in Massachusetts has produced an extraordinary Trappist ale, the only Americans to do it. Well, they just got a new chief mugwump, and apparently he's a teetotaler. And has discontinued the production of these ales. Never mind the fact that they made a lot of money that these guys could then give to charity, right? No, beer's bad, even though everybody else seems to agree it's not. And the problem with that isn't just depriving charity of millions of dollars. It's that nobody in the future, when this guy's gone, and the sooner the better, nobody in the future is going to be able to push a button and reactivate the machines. The institutional knowledge is gone. The machines may very well be gone themselves. The facilities could be repurposed into bunks. Who knows? So the Napa Valley had shut down and is in a terrible state. So when Cesare, Peter, and Robert Mondavi in the 50s are driving north from where they lived in, I want to say Lodi, and they're checking out Charles Krug, the oldest winery in the Napa Valley, the thing is dilapidated. It's not like they can just fire it up. I mean, people have been tearing the wood out of it to use on their own projects, barns and fences for years. It's 4 stone walls and some overrun vineyards. And so the process is long and arduous to get this going again. And that actually, Charles Krug, under the Mondavi stewardship, was the first winery to open after Prohibition, and it took decades.
Wow, interesting. We'll flash forward. So I was in Napa. Well, I was drinking this Parmesan wine in the 70s.
Okay.
I should say my parents were, and I would take my little piece of it. But so it felt like it was coming around. But the 70s were really an inflection point for Napa. Right, we had kind of a dark period coming out of Prohibition, rebuild, bring the intellectual property, equipment, replant vines. But the 70s were an inflection point. So why don't you bring us there?
Sure. So leading up to the 1970s, there were more and more people coming in. Robert Mondavi had opened his own winery after a falling out with his family. So there's Charles Krug, but there's also the Robert Mondavi Winery. Lee Stewart is making some great wines up at Souverain. The Davies family has moved to the area and reopened Schramsberg as a sparkling wine house. So there's some growth, but it's quiet, and outside the valley, not very many people care. Right. And the reason is that everybody believed at that time that the French made the great wine.
Yeah.
And bless everybody else for trying. It was cute that they tried, but it didn't matter if it was California or Nebraska or New Zealand or Australia or Chile or Argentina or South Africa or any other place where everybody knows you can't possibly make wine at this time, right?
Just to tag on to that South African thing, that there's a winery in South Africa. They've got records of when Napoleon was in exile in St. Helena. He ordered cases and cases and cases of South African wine from Constanti, I believe. It's a sweet wine. So this idea that other places couldn't make wine is just, baloney.
Right.
But yes, that was the prevailing view at the time.
Right. No doubt. And that to the point, I mean, this is your podcast. I think your listeners will find this really fascinating. Wine is marketing.
Yeah.
So much of wine. Like, I visited Chapelet Winery 2 days ago. And I always knew they made good wine. I always enjoyed it. If somebody poured me a glass of Chapelet, I had a sense of where Pritchard Hill was, and I enjoyed it. I visited the winery. I met with a number of people there, including Cyril Chapelet. I learned about it. I walked the vineyards. I tasted the wine. I learned about their ethos. I am now a fan of that winery. I will now go buy that wine, whereas previously it was only something I might have stumbled upon, right? And so much of wine is marketing and our connection to it. And so this prevalent belief that only the French made great wine had unfortunately really stuck and was reinforced by critics and so on and so forth. And then, as you said, that changes in the 1970s. It very specifically changes in 1976. Now, I think it's worth noting in 1969, Mike Gudgel was the winemaker at Robert Mondavi. He was the second winemaker at Robert Mondavi after Warren Winiarski. And he made the Reserve Cabernet Sauvignon in 1969 that got 99 points from promising critics. And so that was like okay, all right, we see you, it's really cool you got lucky. But it didn't go much further than that.
Right.
And then in 1976.
It's like scoring a 99 on the calculus test and they say, I was lucky.
Yeah, exactly.
No, it wasn't lucky.
Right.
But
right. You did not guess calculus 99% accurately. Yeah, exactly.
Right.
So actually, do we have time? I'll read a short excerpt of my book that maybe leads us up to this event.
Please go ahead.
Okay, cool. So this comes from The Rise of Napa Valley Wineries. Only his wife, Bella Lawson, could have said for sure if Stephen Spurrier did not wake up every morning with his hair in place, wearing a suit jacket and a collared shirt. A gentle, soft-spoken Englishman with bright eyes and a warm smile, Spurrier was the proud owner of a small wine shop in Paris. He was prim, trim, and always impeccably dressed. His kind voice was as disarming as his palate was impressive, and his enthusiasm for wine was rivaled only by his knowledge. Spurrier had come to own this wine shop by promising its recently widowed Parisian owner, who was understandably somewhat reluctant to sell her husband's pride and joy to, of all things, an Englishman, that he would work there for free for 6 months to demonstrate his commitment. He did, and in 6 months' time, the shop was his. Soon after, Spurrier opened the Académie du Vin in partnership with John Winroth, an American Fulbright scholar turned wine writer from the Herald Tribune. They then hired another Parisian outsider, an American by the name of Patricia Gastaud Gallagher. English speakers peddling France's most prestigious and elite cultural wares back to the French. Why not? However cockamamie the idea might have sounded, it worked. Spurrier and his associates knew that their audience was not, in fact, the French, and took out ads targeting expats who found English-speaking wine merchants less intimidating and thus easier to buy from. Gallagher began to teach at the Académie du Vin, and through friends at the U.S. Embassy, she annually arranged a tasting of American wines on July 4th. What few American wines had any share of the French import market at that time, however, hardly constituted cream having risen to the top. Looking to increase the quality of the American wine she offered, Gallagher telephoned a woman by the name of Joanne Dickinson Dupuy, who lived in Napa since 1951 and who was aspiring to start a business offering international wine tours. The women spoke for a while, and Dupuy suggested some of her personal favorites to Gallagher. Anyone who might have been aware of this conversation would surely have found it innocuous, even mundane. And yet, in the same way that the golden apple of Eurus would result in the fall of Troy, Dupuy's words to Gallagher that day would, in due course, prove to be a golden apple of her own, bringing the walls surrounding the myth of superior French wine crashing to the ground. So what happens is that Gallagher visits a few of Dupuy's favorites, reports back to Spurrier. Spurrier and his wife Bella visit Napa, also Santa Cruz, pick up wines that they really admire, and take them back to France in 1976. And there's a longer story involved, but they take them back to France and they put them up in a blind tasting against French wines, extraordinary French wines like Mouton. And they used the most credentialed possible French judges. And what happens is that the winning wine is a 1973. The winning white wine, excuse me, is a 1973 Chateau Montelena made by Mike Gudgel. And the winning red wine is a 1973 Stag's Leap Wine Cellars SLV made by Warren Winiarski, Cabernet Sauvignon. And so this is covered by exactly one journalist. Everyone else went, we know what's going to happen. It's not worth going. And in fact, the journalist who went, George Tabor, didn't think it was going to be very interesting. He just thought he'd go because he didn't have anything else to do. He said, if it's a slow day, I'll go. Fortunately, it was. He wrote the story down for Time magazine. And all of a sudden, we realized that on French turf with French judges, the American wines won. They were not just a novelty, they were actually a superior product. And after that, and this is what's so important, and this is what inspired me to write the book, because it's not as talked about, the floodgates open.
Yeah.
And so a couple of years later, the Goey Millau hosts the Olympiade du Vin, right? The Wine Olympics. And the winning Sauvignon Blanc comes from Sterling in Napa. The winning Riesling comes from Smith Madrone in Napa. The winning Chardonnay comes from Trefethen in Napa. Joseph Drouhin puts on another tasting. Trefethen wins that. Second place is a Pinot Noir from a completely unknown region of Oregon called Willamette. And, it just goes on from there. And he is recently, 2015, English sparkling wine destroyed Vive and Tattinger and Dom and Paul Roger and all these other great champagnes head to head.
Nice.
It's not because those are bad wines. It's because world-class wine is exactly what it sounds like. It's the wine of the world, and you can make it all around the world.
Interesting. Just to tap on that English sparkling wine for a second, get used to it because, and you know this, right? All of the champagne makers with their chalky white soil have found another place that has chalky white soil like that, which is Dover, Great Cliffs, White Cliffs of Dover. And they're all buying land there because global warming is sending them north to get a cool enough climate. So, go long on sparkling white English wine because that's the future.
Absolutely.
So, excuse me. When you say that the floodgates open, though, in the 70s, Napa was still like agrarian, kind of bunch of farmers making wine, they used modern techniques and so forth, but it was an innocent era, effectively, I would say, compared to, if you flash forward the next 30, 40 years, it has become corporate and industrial and in a very big way. Bigger than almost anywhere else on the planet, I think. It'd be my estimation. But talk to us about the next 20, 30, 40 years of evolution of Napa. I know that's a big ask, but
no, that's it. Absolutely. So there are two things that we need to dwell on. And one of them, and I'm not anti-French. I love the French. I love France.
No. We all hate the French, but we love their wine.
I don't.
I'm kidding. I'm joking.
But the French viewed their winemaking, number one, as a sacred tradition and history, which it is, but they viewed it almost religiously, and so they thought of it as infallible. They couldn't get it wrong anymore. Yeah. And they also viewed a lot of their trade secrets as proprietary. They didn't get together and talk about what they were doing. And the other thing that the French get wrong in wine, unfortunately, and again, I love them, I'm not trying to beat up on them, but the other thing that they get really wrong is that they chalk everything up to terroir, right? Yeah. Which is the combination of land and soil and climate and the aspect of the vineyard and the diurnal range of the location and so on and so forth, right? And they don't include in their definition of terroir human influence. Right. And the people that make the wine and tend the vines and harvest the grapes and the choices they make should absolutely be understood as part of terroir, in my opinion. And so in the United States, Andrei Chelyshev, a white Russian who was brought here by George de la Tour, and who was, I think, almost inarguably the greatest winemaking genius in America's history. Andrei Chelyshev starts gathering people together, people like Martini, the Mondavis, Gudgel, Winiarski, Zelma Long, anybody else who wanted to join them. He'd get them together and he'd go, all right, what do we know? What are we learning? because the Napa Valley is only 30 miles long by 5 miles wide, but it's got half the soil types in the world. It's covered in alluvial fans. It was the bottom of a sea. It's rich in mineral deposits, and it's complex. And so more so than maybe any other swath of land that size. And so, they get together and they go, okay, well, we're, down in the South, that man, the fog doesn't, the fog comes in off San Pablo Bay every single day. It doesn't burn off very quickly. We're finding Chardonnay grows well here.
Mm-hmm.
Folks from Calistoga would go, yeah, we're finding it doesn't grow very well up here. It's quite warm by comparison. And Warren Winiarski and Bernard Porte and others come over from Stag's Leap, and they're like, yeah, what we're finding is that as hot as it is in the day, it gets cold here at night. The diurnal range is serious. And they'd talk and they'd share information about what vines would grow well and yeast strains and on and on and on. And it made them so much better because they didn't, the idea, and Bob Mondavi really pushed this idea, was that the rising tide was going to raise all the ships, and it absolutely did. There's no question that it did, right? Mm. But I want to get back to something else that you said about Napa, and you're not wrong about the industrial nature of parts of it. There are big companies that own a lot of it. It's estimated, Gallo is a family, but they make people estimate they might make 1% of the world's wine. Wow. And so there are families that are massive, and and that's fine. Like, they've succeeded, good for them.
Interesting.
But also those wineries, I really want to emphasize this. When I go to Napa, I seek out those wineries that are small, privately owned. I know when I buy Paradigm Cabernet Sauvignon, which is one of my favorites, Smith Madrone Riesling, Volker Eisley's Terzetto, and others, I know the people who are going to use that money to feed their families. I've met their kids, and I've met their employees, and I know how they treat their vineyard workers. And I'm not pumping money into, forgive me, Constellation or
Jackson family or
right. And Jackson's like Gallo. They are indeed a family. They're just in a wildly successful one. Mm-hmm. And that's fine. But I want to support the little guy, and we vote with our money, right? So I always encourage people to seek out those smaller wineries and to support them because they need the support.
Yep. Well, that harkens back to the 1970s when that's all there was, with these independent family, I feed my family on this money, and it's changed. And that was my point, that it's evolved into, as many farming cultures effectively have changed. They've moved to more corporate, more industrial, more organizationally, but there'll always be room, hopefully, for the independent. It's funny, you talk about terroir in France, and it really shows up when we talk about Grand Cru, Premier Cru, Village. It's all about where the grapes came from that dictate the quality of the wine.
Right.
But I can assure you that if you gave me a couple of metric tons of Grand Cru grapes from Bordeaux, you would not want to drink the wine I made out of that, right? It would have. So, you don't think winemaker has an influence. Let me try to make you some wine and you'll see that it does.
Exactly.
So this was awesome. And unfortunately, Mark, we're limited on time, and I could talk to you about this for hours. I'm sure you'd enjoy it as well. But you do have a book coming out. Let's talk about that for a moment. It's coming out when, and what's the title?
Thank you. So it's funny. People ask me what's the title, and I have to think about it because it's one of those things when you get into the publishing world, some of those decisions are just not yours anymore. So I got to approve the title, but I didn't get to name my own book.
Right.
It's called The Rise of Napa Valley Wineries: How the Judgment of Paris Changed or Put California Wine on the Map.
Okay, it's a good title. When's it available?
Yeah, it's all right.
It's all right.
It comes out May 8th from the History Press. It's available on all the web pages you would normally buy books on, or in very much the same vein as what we were just talking about. Your small bookseller, the little bookseller on the corner, can absolutely order this for you. It'll be nationally distributed, so that would be how I would acquire a copy.
Awesome. I'll go to politics and pros and pick one up then.
Perfect.
Tremendous. Mark, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us and on this particular event. I mean, I learned some things about sort of how the evolution of those particular wines that I hadn't heard before, and sort of what are the implications were to Napa. So I really appreciate, and everybody, if you enjoyed this, go grab a bottle of Napa wine from a local liquor store and enjoy while you listen. So thank you, Mark, so much for joining us. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you, Jim. It was really a pleasure.
Absolutely. Cheers.
Cheers.
This podcast is brought to you by the CEO Project. At the CEO Project, we work with CEOs to help them grow their business. And our members represent billions of dollars of revenue and profit. And frankly, amongst all of us, we've probably made every mistake in the book, including some you haven't made yet. So if you want to learn from the experience of a bunch of really seasoned CEOs, we're a great place to hang out. In this podcast, what you're going to hear are some of those ideas, concepts, and things that are just going to help you on your journey. If you want to find out more, reach out to us at theceoproject.com, or you can contact me personally at jim@theceoproject.com. Happy listening.
Thanks for listening to the Lazy CEO podcast. We'll see you next time, and be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes, and check out our website, www.theceoproject.com.